Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The air was thick with smoke, the kind that clung to your throat and choked out every breath of life. Screams echoed through the darkness as villagers ran toward the blazing compound at the edge of the village. Namdi's house was engulfed in flames, the thatched roof collapsing into a sea of fire that danced against the midnight sky. Inside, two bodies lay motionless, their final cries swallowed by the inferno. Neighbors whispered prayers, but others, those who knew too much, shared fearful glances. They had heard the argument the week before, had seen the bitter glint in Okafor's eyes as he stared at his elder brother's land that stretched rich and green, kissed by morning dew, and blessed with fertility. That land was everything. And now, with Namdi gone, the question was no longer if, but how quickly Okafor would seize it. 7-year-old Mmesoma stood barefoot in the dirt, a torn wrapper wrapped around her tiny body. Her eyes, wide and empty, reflected the flames as they devoured the only home she had ever known. A woman tried to cover her eyes, but Mmesoma didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her parents were gone. Just like that. One moment she was laughing as her mother combed her hair for bed. The next she was being dragged outside, coughing, watching the walls collapse. The villagers murmured that it was a cooking accident, a careless oil fire. But something darker hovered beneath their words. Mmesoma clutched the amulet her father had given her, a simple carved wooden piece shaped like a leaf. For protection, he had said. But tonight, it hadn't protected them. And now she was an orphan, alone, stunned, and unwanted. It didn't take long. The very next morning, Okafor stood tall and somber before the village elders, weeping crocodile tears and claiming his brother's spirit had whispered to him to take Mmesoma in. "She is my blood," he said, pressing a hand to his chest, "and blood must never be abandoned." The elders, swayed by his theatrics, praised him for his kindness. But behind closed doors, his wife hissed like a serpent. "Another mouth to feed? Another rat to scrub my floors?" Okafor only smirked. "Not a rat, a slave. And when I'm done, that land will be mine, fully and legally. No one will suspect a thing." That night, while Mmesoma curled up on the cold floor of a strange hut, mourning her parents, Okafor raised a calabash of palm wine to the stars. The fire was no accident, and neither was what would come next. From the moment she stepped into Okafor's house, Mmesoma ceased to be a child. She became a shadow, the kind that moved silently, served without being seen, and was only noticed when punished. Her cousins called her ugly orphan, mocking the worn-out slippers she wore and the way her bones showed through her blouse. Her aunt, Mama Ifeoma, barked orders like a general, while her own children sat idly under mango trees, sipping malt drinks and snapping selfies with their new smartphones. Every morning before the cock crowed, Mmesoma fetched water from the stream, scrubbed the compound with sand and a ragged broom, and carried heavy baskets of cassava to the market on her head. She was barely 10 when she learned to balance a tray like a professional hawker, selling bean cakes under the sun with cracked lips and blistered feet. When she returned home, she received neither thanks nor food, only curses if she failed to sell enough. Each day carved another piece of her innocence away. At night, she slept near the chicken coop, swatting mosquitoes and covering herself with rags. When she cried, she did it silently, curling into herself and pressing her father's amulet against her chest. It was all she had left of him. She still remembered his voice, warm, deep, calling her my golden girl. But gold had no place in her uncle's house. One afternoon, she overheard a drunk Okafor boasting to a friend, "Namdi gave me too much power in this life. I helped him once or twice. Yes, but did he have to shine so brightly? I was always the fool in his shadow. Now that he's gone, I'll shine instead." And he did shine. He took Namdi's land, registered it in his name, and sold part of it to a businessman from the city. With the money, he built an extension to his house, bought a motorcycle, and enrolled his son in a private school. All while Mmesoma scrubbed his toilets. But even a child's spirit has limits. One evening, after a long day at the market, Mmesoma spilled oil while cooking. Her aunt lashed her with a belt until she bled, screaming that the girl was a curse. Mmesoma didn't scream. She simply stared into the fire, not with tears, but with something deeper. A quiet resolve. That night, she whispered to the stars, "If this is life, I will survive it. If I must suffer, I will not forget. One day, I will matter." Unbeknownst to her, fate had already begun writing the chapters ahead, and somewhere in the distance, a man with a limp and a secret was waiting to change her story forever. Years passed like footprints in wet clay, fading, painful, but always there. By the time Mmesoma turned 16, she had the body of a woman, but the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Her back carried the memory of every cane that lashed her, and her hands bore the calluses of endless labor. Yet in her silence, she carried her parents' memory like a fire that refused to die. When villagers passed her by, few remembered who she truly was. They called her Okafor's slave girl, never guessing that she was the daughter of Namdi, the very man who once saved their village from famine by donating his harvest during a drought. Her father had been a hero, but time and lies had buried his legacy under Okafor's smooth tongue and greedy hand. There were days Mmesoma thought about running away. But where would she go? The only world she knew was this village that spat on her. One afternoon, she sat beneath the iroko tree behind the house and traced lines in the sand, remembering how her father had lifted her up and spun her around like a princess. "Your heart is your throne," he had said. "Guard it well, my golden girl." She wiped a tear and whispered his name. That night, as she slept in the corridor outside her cousin's room, she dreamed of fire again, but this time, she saw her uncle's face in the flames, smirking. She woke up shaking. Deep down, she didn't just suspect it anymore. She knew. Okafor killed her parents. And fate, ever cruel and calculating, delivered its next blow in the form of a decision no one asked her about. One morning, as she returned from the stream with a bucket balanced on her head, she overheard Okafor speaking with an elder. Yes, she's of age. And who better to marry her than that cripple Obina? Nobody else wants her. He'll take her, and she'll be his burden, not mine. The men laughed. Mmesoma froze. Obina, the man villagers called useless, who limped through the market in silence, and was said to live in a hut so small even rats felt sorry. Was this her reward after years of suffering? A cripple she'd never spoken to? Mmesoma turned slowly, the water spilling at her feet. Her uncle noticed and raised a warning brow. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just stood there, numb. It was in that moment she realized. Her uncle didn't just want to ruin her past. He was determined to bury her future too. Mmesoma stood among the crowd at the village square, holding her tray of bitter leaf and okra soup that hadn't sold. Her wrapper was faded. Her feet cracked from long hours walking barefoot, and her face bore the expression of a girl trying not to feel anything anymore. The village was celebrating the chief's youngest son's return from the city, and every family had brought food to share under the festive canopy. But when Mmesoma approached the table, carrying her unsold soup in a rusty pot, her aunt quickly grabbed it and pushed her to the edge of the gathering. "Go and sit with the servants," Mama Ifeoma barked, not even looking at her. Her cousins, draped in freshly sewn Ankara dresses, sat in the front row with powdered faces and confident grins. Mmesoma quietly moved to a stool near the cooking area, her stomach rumbling. She had not eaten since morning. The food was served: jollof rice, fried meat, spicy fish stew, fufu, and the laughter grew louder. Mmesoma's eyes followed each plate passed around, each bite savored by people who once owed their survival to her father. None offered her a plate. She watched children younger than her wipe their mouths with tissue and complain that the rice was too cold. Still, she said nothing. When the servers were done and only scraps remained, her aunt called her over, pointing to a cracked bowl with bones and rice grains. "Take," she said curtly, dropping it in Mmesoma's hand as if feeding a stray dog. The villagers chuckled. One woman said loudly, "She's lucky she even got that. Some orphans don't get anything at all." And just like that, the girl who once rode on her father's shoulders as he greeted elders with pride, the girl who once served guests in a house that was now ashes, became the punchline of a joke. As she sat under the shade of a tree behind the square, tears threatened to fall but didn't. Mmesoma picked at the cold bones in the bowl and stared out into the crowd. She saw her uncle laughing with a councilman, slapping his back and pouring him palm wine. He was no longer mourning her father, if he ever truly had. That same uncle who had been fed from her father's kitchen now walked like a king in stolen sandals. Her pain burned like a hot coal deep in her chest, but she bit down on it, refusing to show weakness. Somewhere inside her, she felt something shift, a resolve she couldn't name yet. One day, they would remember the girl who ate last, not because of her tears, but because of the seat she would later command at the very table that once humiliated her. Mmesoma was sweeping the compound when she heard Okafor call her name. His tone was unusually firm, not the usual bark, but something heavier, as if he had already made a decision and was announcing it to the wind. She wiped sweat from her brow and approached cautiously. He stood with a calabash of palm wine in one hand and a smirk that made her stomach tighten. "You're getting married," he said plainly, not looking at her. "Your bride price will help with my next investment." Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "Married? To who? Why now?" "You should thank me," he continued. "At least you're not dying in this house. You'll be a wife, not a beggar. And don't disgrace me. If you try to run, I'll drag you there myself." That was it. No blessing. No ceremony. No concern for her feelings. Just a business transaction sealed with the same breath he used to talk about goats. That evening, Mmesoma sat in the corner of the kitchen, knees to her chest, staring into the orange glow of the firewood stove. She tried to imagine the face of her husband-to-be, a man she had only seen limping through the market, dragging one leg behind the other, never speaking to anyone. His name was Obina, a recluse whose hut sat on the village's edge, half covered in weeds. He was rumored to be cursed, a man whose mother died during childbirth and whose father was struck blind shortly after. No one knew how he survived. Some villagers believed he lived off scraps. Others thought he was mad. Mmesoma had never heard him speak. And now he was the man she was being given to, not out of love, not out of destiny, but because she was inconvenient. She cried that night, but not out loud. The kind of cry that breaks the soul, without a sound. Just long, slow tears soaking into the soil. Days later, the engagement was done with shocking simplicity. Okafor, dressed in his best igbata, shook hands with Obina's caretaker, an elderly man from a neighboring village. There was no music, no friends, no gifts, no joy. Mmesoma stood in the background, dressed in a second-hand wrapper and oversized blouse. She didn't even get to carry a plate of food. When it was done, Okafor handed her a bag with her clothes and whispered, "Don't return. Your luck is about to change. Maybe your husband will even buy you slippers." He laughed cruelly and turned away. Mmesoma looked once at the house she had scrubbed clean for over a decade. It was not her home. It never had been. Then, without ceremony or farewell, she walked toward the hut of a stranger, a cripple she did not love, with no idea that the man she was being forced to marry held more secrets than the entire village could dream. The morning of the wedding dawned with the sound of a distant cock crowing and a sky cloaked in gray clouds. There was no music, no dancing women in colorful lace, no palm wine flowing in joy. It was a wedding in name alone, an exchange of a life for relief. Mmesoma stood in the middle of the compound in a faded dress that hung awkwardly on her slender frame. Her hair had been poorly braided by her aunt the night before, her scalp still sore from the yanking. Her eyes were swollen from a night of weeping, though she had done it quietly under a borrowed blanket on a neighbor's mat. When Obina arrived, he came alone, walking slowly with the help of a polished wooden cane. His expression was unreadable, his posture straight despite the limp that pulled at his left leg. He wore a plain brown senator outfit that clung to his tall frame, surprisingly clean and well-fitted for someone the village believed to be a beggar. Mmesoma looked at him once, then quickly lowered her eyes. The elder presiding over the wedding coughed awkwardly, trying to inject some spirit into the joyless event. "Let the bride kneel," he said, and Mmesoma obeyed. Obinna did not move closer to her. He did not lift her. He simply looked at her with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, just distant. When it was time to exchange kalanut, he took it without a word. The villagers who had gathered, more out of curiosity than celebration, snickered behind their wrappers. "Two cursed people," one whispered. "One a limper, the other a slave. What a perfect match." Even children laughed. No one clapped when it was done. No one sang. Mama Mmesoma tossed a weak cheer, "May you bear strong sons." But even that felt like mockery. Mmesoma held back tears. She didn't even remember what love felt like. She was just trying to remember how to breathe. After the final rites, Okafor handed Obinna the small bag of Mmesoma's belongings. "She's your problem now," he said, slapping his back as if congratulating a man who bought a used generator. Obinna nodded without emotion and turned to walk. Mmesoma followed behind him like a ghost. Her feet trembled with every step, her heart a confused mix of dread and exhaustion. When they arrived at his compound, a small but well-kept hut surrounded by bushes, Obinna opened the door and gestured inside. "You'll sleep there," he said, pointing to a mat in the corner. "I don't want noise. I don't want complaints. And don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you." His voice was calm but cold, each word a blade. Then he walked into his room and shut the door without looking back. Mmesoma stood there alone again, married yet abandoned. She lay on the mat, curled into herself, and whispered her mother's name until sleep took her. But even in sleep, peace did not come. The days that followed the wedding were a quiet form of torment, not filled with beatings or shouting, but with silence so loud it crushed Mmesoma's spirit. Obinna barely spoke. When he did, his words came out cold and measured, like someone giving instructions to a stranger who had overstayed their welcome. "Fetch water. Clean the kitchen. Don't disturb me." That was the extent of their communication. He would leave early in the morning and return late, his walking stick tapping the ground with quiet authority, his clothes somehow always neat despite the dust. At first Mmesoma believed he truly was poor, perhaps just neat and disciplined. But the house confused her. While it looked modest from the outside, the inside was suspiciously well kept. There were books on a shelf, a solar lantern that never ran out, and clothing far too fine for a crippled man living on the village's edge. Still, she dared not ask. She had learned long ago that questions could cost her food, or worse. The worst part was the emotional vacuum. Mmesoma had survived beatings, starvation, mockery, but never such emptiness. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that even in a loveless marriage, there might be occasional moments of shared humanity. A smile over breakfast, a question about her health, maybe even a shared story under the stars. But Obinna offered none of that. He ate alone in his room. He never allowed her into his space. When she attempted small talk, he would grunt or simply walk away. Once she tried to ask about the books on his shelf, curious about how a man who was supposed to be uneducated had titles like The Art of War and Letters to a Young Poet. Obinna simply stared at her for a few seconds and said, "If you finish your chores early, you won't have time to wander into nonsense." That night, she cried quietly on the mat, hugging her knees. It wasn't just loneliness anymore. It was rejection layered on top of every past wound she had ever buried. But even in his coldness, Obinna was not cruel in the way Okafor had been. He never hit her. He never shouted. He didn't insult her the way her aunt did. He left her money once in a while to buy food from a market, a few crisp naira notes that always smelled of perfume, though she didn't know why. And whenever she was too tired to cook, he would eat whatever she could manage without comment. These small gestures confused her. He was distant, yes, but not wicked. At least not in the way she had known wickedness. And slowly, suspicion grew in her heart. Who, exactly, was this man she was married to? Why did he walk with the posture of a man used to power? Why did his fingers feel like someone who had held pens, not hoes? And why did he always lock the door to his bedroom every single time he left the house, even when she was the only one home? The answers to Mmesoma's questions began to surface, not through discovery, but through quiet observation. One afternoon, as she cleaned the backyard, she noticed a well-dressed man arrive on a motorcycle. Not the rickety kind that the villagers rode, but a sleek black model with polished rims and chrome handles. The man wore sunglasses, city shoes, and a long-sleeved shirt with cufflinks. He wasn't from the village. Without knocking, he walked straight into Obina's room, the one that was always locked. Mmesoma dropped her broom and hid behind the window, heart pounding. For nearly an hour, hushed voices murmured within. Occasionally she caught phrases, "the lawyer said," and "transfer of ownership," and "we'll need to disguise it further." She strained her ears, but the words were too muffled. When the man left, he nodded politely at her and even smiled. "Good afternoon, madam," he said with respect in his tone, a tone she'd never received from anyone outside. Mmesoma was too stunned to respond. That night, Obina didn't mention the visitor. He ate his dinner in silence as usual, then disappeared into his room. But the air between them had changed. Something shifted. Mmesoma couldn't sleep. She replayed the man's words in her head over and over. Transfer of ownership. Disguise. Lawyer. Those were not words used by poor men in broken huts. And then there was the way the man had greeted her, as if she mattered, as if she carried a title. Something didn't add up. The books, the clothes, the money, the phone call she had once overheard in English, a language Obina pretended not to understand, but had spoken fluently when she thought he was alone. Everything was a mask, a carefully constructed disguise. She began to realize she didn't marry a crippled beggar. She married someone who was hiding wealth, perhaps power, maybe even a past the village wasn't ready to hear. The realization didn't come with excitement. It came with fear. What if she had been dragged into something bigger than herself? What if this marriage was part of a larger lie? Was she safe? Or just a pawn? The next morning, she walked to the stream but took a different route, past the home of an old friend of her mother's, Mama Ijeoma. The woman had always been kind to her, sneaking her food when she was younger. "Who is Obina?" she finally asked. The old woman looked at her with narrowed eyes. "The one you married?" she whispered. "That one is not ordinary. He came here 10 years ago, injured, alone, but carrying silence like a crown. He never begged, never asked for help. And yet, no matter how poor we thought he was, he never lacked. They say he's cursed, but I think he's hiding." Mmesoma's stomach twisted. She thanked her and walked home slowly. One thing was certain, her husband was not who he claimed to be. It didn't take long for Okafor to come sniffing around like a hungry hyena. Word had reached him that Obina's compound was not as shabby as expected. Someone from the village council had mentioned seeing a delivery man bring crates of goods to the house, biscuits, foreign drinks, expensive yams. Another neighbor gossiped that Obina had paid for a new borehole behind his compound. On whose money? Okafor barked at Mama Ijeoma. How can a cripple build a borehole? He couldn't let it go. The idea that his trash of a niece might be living comfortably, or worse, happily, with a man he thought was beneath dirt lit a fire of rage in his gut. He shaved his beard, wore his finest kaftan, and marched to their home one Saturday morning, pretending to bring greetings. But the real motive behind his visit was greed and suspicion. Mmesoma was sweeping the compound when she saw him arrive. Her heart raced with a mix of dread and anger. Obina was sitting on a low stool under the shade, reading a book in silence. When Okafor entered, he put on his warmest, fakest smile. "Ah, in-law. My son," he cried dramatically, raising his arms. Obina looked up calmly and said, "Good morning." That was all. No welcome, no handshake. Okafor's face twitched briefly, but he covered it. He sat down uninvited and began a long, exaggerated story about his crops and how difficult times were. Then he looked directly at Mmesoma and said, "I hope she is working well for you. That one knows how to carry firewood." The insult wasn't even subtle. Obina didn't flinch. He closed his book and replied softly, "She's my wife, not my worker. And yes, she is useful, in ways that matter." That reply felt like thunder. For the first time in years, someone defended her, not just passively, but publicly. Okafor was rattled. He cleared his throat and tried to pivot. "I was just saying, Since you both are doing well, maybe we can talk about investing in my palm oil business. Obina stood abruptly. I don't invest in liars, he said. His voice was calm, but every word cut like a blade. And I don't forget what people do to those who can't defend themselves. Okafor's face went pale. He stood too, chuckling nervously. I don't know what you mean, my son. But Obina had already turned away. The message was clear. The door was closed, figuratively and literally. That evening, Mmesoma stared at her husband across the dinner mat, and for the first time, she saw not just a man with secrets, but a man with backbone, a man who might, just might, be willing to fight for her. And inside her chest, where only pain had lived for years, something warm finally stirred. Hope. It was the third day without rain, and the sun scorched down on the village like a punishment from the gods. Mmesoma had been working without rest, cleaning, cooking, washing Obina's clothes by hand, and tending to a small vegetable patch behind the house. She hadn't eaten all day. Her strength waned, but she pushed herself, too afraid of Obina's silence, to take a break. As she stooped to scrub the last of his clothes near the basin, her vision blurred. The ground beneath her shifted. Before she could reach for support, the world tilted, and everything went dark. When she opened her eyes, she was inside the house, lying on a mat she didn't remember crawling onto, her head resting on a clean towel. A cold, wet cloth had been placed on her forehead, and the air smelled of menthol balm. Slowly turning her head, she saw him, Obina, seated in the corner, arms folded, eyes watching her. You fainted, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I called a nurse. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, she said you were dehydrated. Mmesoma blinked back tears, not from the pain in her head, but from something far more unfamiliar, concern. Real concern. For the first time since their marriage, Obina had touched her without disdain. She noticed the half-empty bottle of water beside her and realized he had been tending to her while she was unconscious. She shifted slightly, expecting to be scolded, but he only said, you work too much. You don't have to prove anything. She stared at him, confused. The man who had refused to speak more than 3 words to her was now sitting like a worried husband beside her, voice low, eyes serious. I didn't mean to push you, he said, almost inaudibly. I just didn't know how to be a husband. The words hit her harder than any slap she had endured in her uncle's house. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he had been so cold, why he had kept her locked out of his heart. But instead, she just whispered, thank you. And the silence that followed wasn't heavy like before, it was healing. For the next few days, Obina changed. He didn't become sweet overnight, but something had shifted. He left water for her every morning before going out. He asked if she had eaten. Once, he even told her to sit while he fetched something from the back room, a simple task, but to Mmesoma, it felt like a grand gesture. The walls between them were still thick, but there was now a small window, cracked open. She began to notice things, how he lingered just a little longer when she spoke, how his voice had lost its edge when he called her name. One night, as she folded his clothes neatly, she found a note tucked beneath a shirt. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but the handwriting was bold, and the words clear. Sometimes we pretend to be stone so the world doesn't see how much we've already been broken. She folded it back and placed it exactly where she found it. She didn't say a word, but for the first time since the fire took everything from her, she began to wonder if healing could start in the most unlikely places. It was a market day when Mmesoma sliced her hand while cutting vegetables for soup. The knife had slipped too fast, too sharp, and pain bloomed in her palm like a sudden flame. She yelped softly, more from surprise than agony, and instinctively tried to hide the wound. Blood dripped onto the kitchen floor, forming small red puddles around her feet. In the past, such an injury would have earned her a slap or a lecture. Her aunt would have called her useless. Her uncle would have called her cursed. But now, in this quiet compound on the edge of the village, something different happened. Obina, who had just returned from a stream, dropped the bucket and rushed to her side. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice urgent but not angry. He took her hand gently in his and pulled her toward the inner room, his room, where she had never been allowed before. Mmesoma's heart pounded not just from the pain, but from shock. His room was nothing like the rest of the house. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, the floor tiled, and a faint smell of cedarwood hung in the air. A black leather bag sat on a table, filled with medical supplies. Without a word, Obinna opened it, pulled out a clean cloth, alcohol wipes, and bandages. "This will sting," he said, meeting her eyes briefly before cleaning the wound with surprising tenderness. Mmesoma winced, biting her lip, but didn't pull away. His hands were steady, and for the first time she noticed the scar on his wrist, a thin, long mark that disappeared into his sleeve. "How did you know what to do?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, then shrugged. "You learn things when you've spent years patching your own wounds." She nodded, and for a moment, their eyes held a silent understanding. Two broken people, stitched together not by love yet, but by pain that only they could recognize in each other. He helped her sit on a small cushioned chair in the corner of the room and placed a bowl of warm water by her feet. She stared at it, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Obinna stood still for a moment, then sat opposite her. "Because I see you now," he said simply, "and I wish I had seen you earlier." The words settled between them like balm. Mmesoma looked down at her hand, now wrapped neatly in gauze, and back at the man who had once refused to speak more than a command. Something had changed in his eyes, softer now, almost afraid. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because in that quiet, strange room, surrounded by secrets and stories not yet told, the first seeds of healing were sown. Word spreads fast in villages, especially when it carries the scent of scandal or surprise. Ever since Mmesoma collapsed and Obinna began behaving differently, tongues had started to wag. Some women at the stream whispered that Mmesoma had cast a love spell. Others said Obinna was slowly losing his mind. The truth was less dramatic. He was simply beginning to care. But in a village where kindness from a man, especially a broken one, was rare, people preferred stories. One morning, as Mmesoma made her way to the market, two women stood beside a pepper stall and sneered. "You've become Madam now, ABI," one of them said. "Don't forget, it's still a cripple you married." The other laughed. "Even with your fine skin, no one else wanted you. That man picked you from pity." Mmesoma paused. Something in her chest quaked, the old shame that used to silence her. But then, she breathed in deeply and turned around. She faced them squarely, her voice calm but firm. "He may have a limp, but at least he has a heart." The women blinked in surprise. "He treats me better than men with working legs and empty souls. And no, he didn't pick me from pity. We were both picked by pain, and we're learning to walk again together." The market grew quiet. People turned to stare. For the first time, Mmesoma's voice wasn't small. It carried weight. She gathered her basket and walked away with her head high. Obinna was waiting near the gate when she returned. She didn't say anything at first, but he must have sensed it. "Did someone speak to you badly?" he asked. She smiled faintly and shook her head. "Not badly. Just loud enough for me to remember who I'm not anymore." He watched her for a while, something like admiration in his eyes. "You're stronger than most people I know," he said softly. "Stronger than me." That night, after dinner, Obinna brought out a small wooden stool and asked her to sit. "There's something I want to give you," he said. From his room, he brought out a cloth-wrapped object and placed it in her hands. She opened it slowly and gasped. It was a new set of wrappers, real Ankara, vibrant and beautiful, the kind worn by dignitaries' wives. "I bought this a while ago," he said. "Didn't know when I'd be ready to give it. But after today, you deserve it." Mmesoma's hands trembled. She had never owned anything this fine in her life. She looked up at him, eyes glassy with tears, and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head. "Don't thank me. You're not who they said you were, Mmesoma. You're not cursed. You're a woman of worth." And that night, for the first time since she was orphaned, she slept not just in peace, but in dignity. The village was a place of eyes, sharp, calculating eyes that watched every movement, every shift in fortune. It didn't take long for Okafor to notice that something about Mmesoma's new life didn't quite align with the story he had written in his head. She was supposed to be suffering, wasn't she? Supposed to be crawling in shame, fetching firewood barefoot, and begging for pepper from market women. But instead he began to hear strange things, about how Obinna now sent her to the market with real money, how her skin looked fresher, how she wore clean clothes and walked like someone who mattered. His blood boiled every time he heard a new whisper. "Are you sure that man is poor?" one man had asked him at the beer joint. "Because I saw crates of bottled water delivered to his compound. And I saw his wife wearing a gold earring last week." Okafor brushed it off with a laugh, but it gnawed at him like a termite in dry wood. One evening, after pacing his compound restlessly, Okafor summoned his eldest son. "Follow her," he ordered. "Follow that foolish girl next time she goes to the market. See where she shops. See what she buys. I want to know everything." The next day, the boy did just that. And what he reported nearly sent Okafor into a fit. "She went to the big trader's shop, Papa," the boy said. "She bought rice, tinned milk, seasoning cubes, and even golden cooking oil. She paid in full. No begging." Okafor slammed his walking stick into the ground. "That cripple is hiding something," he roared. "He deceived me. No one gives a beggar's daughter that kind of life unless he's hiding wealth." The rage wasn't just about Mmesoma's comfort, it was about losing control. He had designed her future, hand-picked her misery, and now someone was interfering with the blueprint of her destruction. Worse, that someone was the very man he thought he was humiliating. Driven by his growing paranoia, Okafor decided to visit Obinna unannounced a second time, this time not with fake smiles, but with an agenda. He wore his finest white kaftan and carried a bottle of cheap liquor. But Obinna met him at the gate, his face unreadable. "I'm not receiving guests today," he said. Okafor chuckled, pretending to be casual. "It's just me, your in-law. I brought something to drink. You know, to celebrate the marriage again now that things are looking rosy." Obinna's jaw tightened. "We didn't celebrate it the first time. And I don't drink with people who didn't believe she was worth more." Okafor's mask cracked, just briefly. "You're bold these days, Obinna. A cripple with confidence. Must be nice." Obinna stared at him for a long time, then said quietly, "When you've lost everything and survived, confidence is the only thing that doesn't rot." With that, he closed the gate, leaving Okafor to stare through the metal, like a rejected spy. The wind shifted that evening. Something told Okafor this was no ordinary man, and that terrified him more than he was willing to admit. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Mmesoma found a letter that would change everything. She had been tidying Obinna's room, a task he had never allowed her to do before. But after much persistence, he finally relented, saying softly, "Just don't touch the drawers." Naturally, that was where her curiosity went. Not out of rebellion, but because she had started to feel like she was living in the middle of a riddle, with no clear answer. As she dusted the shelf above his reading desk, a loose envelope fell from a gap behind the books. Her instinct was to place it back without looking, but her eyes caught the heading, "Private Estate Holdings, Final Confirmation of Asset Transfer." Her breath caught. She turned the envelope around slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside was a legal document, names, figures, seals. And there it was, Obinna Chukwuemeka, sole heir to Chukwuemeka Global Group, worth N$4.7 billion. Her knees nearly buckled. She sat on the edge of the bed, the paper still in her hand. Her mind reeled. Was this real? Was she dreaming? Her husband, the man the entire village mocked as a cripple, was heir to billions? She read it over and over, as if the truth would evaporate if she blinked too fast. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The books, the pristine clothing, the discreet deliveries, the polished man from the city, the medical kit in the leather bag. Obinna hadn't been hiding poverty. He had been hiding power. But why? Why pretend to be a beggar? Why keep it from her, his wife? And then a wave of hurt swept over her. Was she just another test in his carefully controlled life? Another pawn in a rich man's social experiment? Her fingers trembled as she replaced the document, her chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. By the time Obinna returned that evening, her entire understanding of him had been torn apart. They sat in silence for a long time after dinner. Then, slowly, she looked up. Why did you lie to me? She asked. Obinna froze. He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. He sat across from her, shoulders tense, lips parted as if searching for the right lie, but finding none that would hold weight. I didn't lie, he said eventually. I withheld the truth. There's a difference. She stared at him, eyes burning. You let the world believe you were useless. You let me believe it. You watched me suffer humiliation, thinking I had been dumped into more pain. Why? His answer was a whisper. Because I wanted to know if you could see a man even if the world said he wasn't one. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Mmesoma rose, walked into her corner, and curled into herself. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But she knew one thing for sure. She had married a stranger. And now the truth stood between them like a wall she wasn't sure she wanted to climb. The next morning, Obinna didn't go out. He stayed home, pacing, hesitating at her door, retreating, then returning again. Mmesoma didn't speak. She cooked, swept, fetched water. But she moved around like a ghost, present but unreachable. The atmosphere was tense, like two volcanoes waiting to erupt. By evening, Obinna finally knocked gently on the wooden divider between their sleeping spaces. Please, he said. Let me talk. She didn't respond, but she didn't push him away either. He stepped in, slowly. The light from the lantern flickered across his face, casting shadows beneath his tired eyes. He sat on the floor, leaving space between them, and began to speak, not with confidence, but with the trembling voice of someone revisiting wounds buried too deep for too long. My real name is Obinna Chukwuemeka. My father is Chief J.C. Chukwuemeka, owner of Chukwuemeka Global Group. I was born into wealth, but not into love. He went on to explain how his childhood had been one of expectations, not affection. His limp came from a car accident when he was 14, an accident caused by his father's recklessness. But instead of care, Obinna received shame. His father began hiding him from the public eye, pretending the accident never happened. When Obinna asked why, the old man said, weakness is not marketable. So Obinna left the mansions, the foreign schools, the bodyguards, and came to the village, seeking obscurity, peace, and anonymity. I thought, he said, if I could live among people who didn't know my name, I could rebuild myself. But even here, they judged me. They laughed at my limp. Then I heard about you. He turned to her. The orphan who ate last. The girl who swept floors and never cried. I didn't plan to marry you at first. But when your uncle offered you, I accepted because I wanted to see if someone who had nothing would treat someone like me with dignity. Tears welled in Mmesoma's eyes, not out of sympathy, but from the ache of layered pain. You used me, she whispered, to test if your trauma made you lovable. Obinna shook his head, his eyes wet now too. I didn't mean to, but I did, and I regret it every day. I was trying to protect myself from another betrayal. I didn't know I would fall in love with you. That last sentence shattered something inside her. It wasn't what she expected. He said it with such sincerity, such desperation, that it silenced her anger, if only for a moment. She looked at him, not as the stranger who hid wealth from her, but as the broken man who had wrapped her bleeding hand just days ago. And in that moment, her heart trembled in confusion. She didn't forgive him, not yet. But for the first time, she understood that they were not enemies. They were survivors of betrayal, of grief, of loneliness. Two wounded souls, colliding in a marriage neither of them truly understood until now. When news of Obinna's true identity reached Okafor, it didn't come as a formal announcement or declaration. It came as a whisper in the night, the kind of whisper that burns through the corridors of envy. A former classmate of Obinna's had passed through the village and mentioned it casually in the beer parlor. You don't know Obinna Chukwuemeka? That man's father is Chief J.C., one of the richest men in the East. The boy ran off after an accident years ago, but I saw him last month in Enugu. He was at a private conference with top estate developers. Limp or not, that man is loaded. Okafor nearly choked on his drink. The room spun. The man he had mocked as a cripple was a billionaire. He could barely sleep that night, pacing in circles, replaying all the missed signs, the lost opportunities, The fact that he had given his niece away like a bag of yam to a man who turned out to be an empire in disguise. By morning, the hunger for wealth was back in his belly, roaring louder than ever. He called his wife and laid out a new plan. We'll be kind to her now. We'll visit her more. We'll find a way to worm back in. And before the year ends, that boy will put something in my hand, or better still, will use me for one of his businesses. But Mama Mmesoma, sharp-tongued and skeptical, raised her brows. After everything we did to that girl, you think she'll forget? Women hold grudges in their bones. Okafor waved it off. That girl is naive. I trained her to obey. One smile, one gift, she'll open the door. Wait and see. So he put on his best igbata and made another journey to Obina's house. This time he came bearing gifts, 2 tubers of yam, a bottle of wine, and a smile that stretched far too wide to be trusted. But when Mmesoma opened the gate and saw him standing there, something inside her stiffened. She didn't say a word, didn't smile, didn't step aside. She simply stared at him, long and hard. Mmesoma, my daughter, Okafor began, fake warmth in his voice. You forgot me so quickly? I just came to see how you and your husband are doing. Obina stepped out just then, watching from behind her. We're fine, he said coolly. What do you want? Okafor chuckled. Come on, in-law. Can't a man visit his family again? Obina's face didn't move. Family takes care of their own. You didn't take care of her. You threw her away. There was no shouting, just words spoken with such calm finality that it made Okafor flinch. You're not welcome here, Obina added. And if you ever come near her again for money, respect, or lies, I will make sure your past actions are made public. All of them. Okafor's smile broke. The weight of those words crushed his pride. Mmesoma closed the gate, and for the first time her uncle turned back, not with victory in his eyes, but fear. After Okafor's shameful visit, Mmesoma sat on the porch, staring into the dimming sunset, her heart beating with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Obina joined her in silence, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The air around them felt different now, less tense, more unified. For the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in her own marriage. She felt protected, seen. You didn't have to say all that, she whispered finally, staring at her hands. Obina looked at her, his voice steady. Yes, I did. That man broke you in pieces. If I had said nothing, it would have meant I agreed with him. She blinked back the sting in her eyes. Thank you, she said, not just for the defense, but for the way he had placed her dignity above her bloodline. It was the first time in years someone had chosen her, openly, fiercely. The wound in her soul didn't disappear, but it stitched itself just a little tighter that day. The news spread quickly across the village that Okafor had been publicly embarrassed at Obina's gate. Many were shocked. Others delighted in the downfall of a man they had long suspected was not as noble as he claimed. For years, Okafor had strutted around like a lion, pretending to have sacrificed for his poor orphan niece. Now the mask was off, and Obina didn't stop there. A week later, he attended the village council meeting, a gathering he had always avoided, and spoke plainly. I may limp, he said, but I don't beg, and I don't tolerate men who prey on the weak. His words were like a slap to every elder who had once praised Okafor for taking Mmesoma in. Obina offered no proof, no papers, just his voice. And sometimes truth doesn't need evidence, it only needs courage. That day, villagers began to look at Mmesoma differently, no longer as the cursed orphan, but as the wife of the man who had shut a corrupt mouth and opened the village's eyes. At home that night, Obina handed her a box. Inside were business documents, land deeds, titles, a proposal to start a local palm oil processing company under her name. This is yours, he said, not because you're my wife, but because you deserve to stand. You're not someone to hide anymore. Her hands shook as she held the papers. She had never seen her name printed so boldly on anything other than a school attendance list. I don't even know how to run a business, she said, tears already trailing her cheeks. He smiled gently. Then we'll learn. Together. And at that moment, everything her uncle tried to crush in her, confidence, dignity, worth, began to rise like dawn after the darkest night. She was no longer just the girl who swept floors. She was no longer just the orphan who married a cripple. She was a woman being built back up brick by a man who finally saw her not as a burden, but as a queen. The storm that finally broke Okafor did not come from Obinna. It came from the past, a past he had long buried under lies, intimidation, and forged documents. One of the village elders, Pa Ikena, who had always carried quiet suspicion about the fire that killed Namdi and his wife, finally spoke up. At the town's annual Justice Forum, a traditional event where villagers could voice deep-seated grievances, the old man stood and cleared his throat. "I kept quiet for too long," he began, his voice frail but clear. "But conscience has no expiry date." The villagers turned toward him in surprise. He continued, "The night Namdi's house burned, I saw Okafor leaving the compound. I asked what he was doing there. He said he came to fetch something, but his hands were stained with oil, and his voice shook." The silence in the square was deafening. Pa Ikena trembled as he removed a paper from his wrapper. This is the sworn affidavit I wrote and kept for years, because I feared him. But now I give it to the council. Let the truth be known." Shock spread like wildfire. Gasps echoed. People began murmuring. For years, they had accepted the fire as an accident, consoled by Okafor's convenient narrative that God gives and takes. But now, the whispers they had long ignored resurfaced with vengeance. Obinna stepped forward. This man was the only relative Mmesoma had left. He should have been her shield. Instead, he took everything and turned her into a slave. More elders began to speak. One woman admitted she had seen Okafor threaten Namdi over land disputes. Another said he had tried to bribe her into testifying that the fire was caused by a kerosene explosion. The entire village watched as Okafor, once proud and boastful, sat like a deflated balloon. His head hung low. For the first time in his life, he couldn't speak. No one clapped. No one defended him. It was a burial of reputation, of false legacy, and of deceit. That night, Mmesoma sat with Obinna by the fire, tears sliding down her face, not from grief, but from release. "All these years," she whispered, "I thought I was cursed. I thought I was the reason they died." Obinna held her hand tightly. "No, you were the reason they lived long enough to love. You were never the curse. He was." She nodded slowly, finally allowing herself to believe it. The past, though painful, had finally spoken. And though it could never be erased, it no longer had the power to chain her. Obinna wrapped his arm around her shoulder. "Now you know," he said, "and now we can build." The fire crackled beside them as if in agreement. The ghosts of yesterday had been named. And tomorrow, for the first time in a long time, felt free. The journey to the city felt like stepping through a portal, not just in place, but in destiny. Obinna insisted they make the trip in silence, giving Mmesoma space to absorb the weight of everything that had happened. Her uncle's disgrace had not only freed her emotionally, but also awakened a confidence she never thought she possessed. As they drove through the bustling streets of Enugu, skyscrapers rising above busy roads and people rushing in every direction, she clutched the soft leather handbag Obinna had given her. Inside was a printed proposal, her proposal, to launch the first village-based palm oil refinery in partnership with local women. "You won't just rise alone," Obinna had told her days before. "You'll lift others with you." That vision filled her with fire. For once, her hands were not just for washing floors. They were for writing contracts, signing documents, shaping futures. When they arrived at the estate, Mmesoma could hardly breathe. The house, no, the mansion, rose before her like something out of a dream she was never allowed to dream. A glassy driveway, trimmed hedges, golden lighting, and a staff of drivers, gardeners, and cooks who bowed as Obinna stepped out. They bowed to her too. "Welcome home, madam," one of them said with sincerity, not pity. Mmesoma stood frozen for a moment, her eyes scanning everything. The marble pillars, the fountains, the foreign car-lined driveway. This was her husband's other life. The life he had kept buried beneath dust and silence. And now he was giving it to her, not because she asked, not because she begged, but because he believed she finally saw her own worth. Inside, every room shimmered with wealth and grace. But the most beautiful thing was the nameplate in the inner study. Mmesoma Chukwuemeka, co-founder, Rebirth Foundation. It wasn't a decoration. It was real. Her own corner of the world. Her own story. That evening, as she walked down the spiral staircase in a simple but elegant white gown, Obinna stood waiting by the window, eyes soft with pride. "You wear this life with grace," he said. Mmesoma smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I still don't know if I belong here," she whispered. "I've spent so many years believing I was meant to serve others, not lead them." He reached for her hand, kissed it gently, and said, "You don't belong here because of what you have. You belong here because of who you've become." That night, they didn't make love in the way people expect in romance novels. They simply sat on the balcony, fingers intertwined, watching the stars. Two broken souls who had once been discarded by life, now sitting atop the empire they never asked for, but slowly built, together. The orphan was no longer hungry. She was no longer begging. She was no longer forgotten. She had become queen, not by crown, but by courage. In the months that followed, Okafor's life unraveled, like a sweater pulled from the wrong end. The village that once praised him now crossed the street to avoid him. Farmers withdrew their handshakes. Elders, who once ate his goat meat and drank his palm wine, refused to sit with him at council meetings. His sons, who once mimicked his arrogance, began to question his decisions, ashamed by what they heard. The land he once stole was repossessed by the government when the investigation into Nnamdi's death led to a reopened case involving fraudulent property registration. He tried to bribe his way out, but no money came. His crops dried up. His influence vanished. And worst of all, the one girl he once beat, mocked, and sold like leftover bread was now the name on everyone's lips, Mmesoma Chukwuemeka, the village girl who became a queen in the city, whose refinery had given dozens of women jobs, whose name appeared in newspapers and radio programs as a rising voice for rural transformation. One hot afternoon, a now broken Okafor came walking to her compound in the village, barefoot, holding a walking stick not unlike Obinna's. Not because he was crippled, but because life had finally bent his back the way it had bent hers once. Mmesoma was visiting to supervise the refinery site when she heard murmurs that a strange-looking man was at the gate. When she saw him, her heart paused. He looked thinner, smaller, not physically, but in presence. The arrogant man who once threw her out without food now stood shaking, holding his cap in both hands. "I came to say I'm sorry," he whispered, unable to meet her eyes. "I lost everything. I see now what I did, what I became. I thought I was burying your father, but I buried myself instead." His voice cracked, and for a fleeting second, she saw a shadow of the brother her father once tried to save. Mmesoma didn't respond right away. She stood there, regal in her posture, her eyes not filled with revenge, but something deeper. "You didn't just hurt me," she said quietly. "You erased my childhood. You made me believe I was unwanted. You stole my voice. But I found it again, and I'm not going to waste it screaming at the past." She called for her assistant and instructed them to give him food, clean water, and a small transport stipend. "That's not forgiveness," she added. "That's closure." Okafor dropped to his knees, tears streaming. She turned and walked away, into her new office, into her new life, into the version of herself he had tried to destroy, but instead helped forge. Sometimes the worst people make the strongest women. And as the gates closed behind her, the villagers watched in awe. Mmesoma, the orphan who once ate last, had not just survived. She had conquered. And in her silent exit, she taught them all, you don't need to shout to make your power known. Sometimes you just need to rise. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.